Throughout history, the world's most powerful governments have hidden something far more terrifying than weapons. They've hidden the truth about the experiments they hoped no one would ever discover. Because while we were taught clean, simple versions of history behind locked doors and classified memos, the US, Japan, and Nazi Germany were running programs so dark they don't even sound real. The US tried to weaponize demons. Nazi officials searched the earth for ancient gods and mythical superweapons. Psychic soldiers were trained to read minds from continents away. Japan built a biological research facility that performed the unthinkable, then had its crimes erased. Nazi scientists responsible for death and destruction? America hired them, protected them, and called them assets. And before MK Ultra, the CIA ran two even darker projects designed to completely rewrite the human mind. Each story was buried, denied, sanitized, until now. Because all these programs, demons, mind control, psychic warfare, biological horror, occult science, weren't random. They were part of a global race to control the human mind, the unseen world, and even reality itself. And the craziest part, some of them worked. At least enough to terrify the governments who created them and force them to cover their tracks forever. So before the video starts, prepare yourself, because everything you're about to hear was once classified, denied, or erased. And it proves history is far stranger and darker than we were ever meant to know. They don't teach this in military history, because nobody wants to admit the US government once tried to weaponize demons. Not symbols, not metaphors, actual demons. Project MK often began when the Pentagon panicked during the Cold War. They believed the Soviets were researching paranormal warfare, curses, mediums, black magic rituals, anything that could break a soldier's mind without firing a bullet. So instead of laughing it off, the US decided to match them, and they built a program that crossed the line so hard it still sounds like fiction. They hired astrologers, fortune tellers, practitioners of ceremonial magic. They paid witches. They consulted demonologists. They studied ancient grimoires, not as literature, but as instruction manuals. The goal? To see if non-physical entities could influence human behavior, spread fear, manipulate decision-making, or even trigger hallucinations in battlefield environments. This wasn't fringe. CIA officers, Army intelligence, and top-level Pentagon staff were all involved. MK often tested rituals. They attempted to summon presences. They evaluated whether certain rooms became colder, whether machines malfunctioned, whether experienced observers felt followed or watched. One internal memo described anomalous manifestations during a controlled ritual: shadow movement, unexplained temperature drops, equipment failure. Another incident involved a psychic medium who allegedly predicted the death of a naval officer down to the date. Weeks later, it happened. By 1972, the project escalated. They partnered with pharmaceutical labs, testing how drugs combined with occult practices affected fear, obedience, and hallucination. It was mind control mixed with demonology, the kind of experiment you'd expect from a collapsing empire, not the world's strongest military. Some researchers quit. Others refused to enter certain rooms. One scientist claimed he woke up every night at 3:07 a.m. hearing whispering in his hallway. Another swore that something followed him home. The Pentagon eventually pulled the plug, not because it didn't work, but because the political cost of being exposed would have been catastrophic. They buried the documents, classified the failures, deleted the names, and pretended it never existed. But here's the truth. MK Ultra tried to control minds. MK often tried to control the unseen. And the US government walked away from it quietly, like someone who opened a door they realized shouldn't exist. Most armies looked for fuel, maps, and weapons. The SS looked for Atlantis. Himmler believed Nazi ideology wasn't just political, it was cosmic. He thought the Aryan race came from a vanished god civilization, wiped out by ancient floods. And he was convinced that traces of this race still existed somewhere in the world. So he built an organization, the Ahnenerbe, and funded expeditions that read like insane adventure novels with a genocidal twist. Teams were sent to Tibet to measure skulls, convinced that monks guarded secrets about an ancient Aryan migration. Others went into the Arctic looking for entrances to a hollow Earth. Some searched remote caves for the legendary Spear of Destiny, supposedly the weapon that pierced Christ. Himmler believed whoever controlled the spear would control the world. They dug through deserts searching for giant bones, literal giants, because Nazi myth claimed ancient superhumans once ruled Europe. When they found ordinary skeletons, they simply reclassified them as deformed Aryans. In Norway, they hunted for runes they believed were magical. In France, they raided monasteries for grimoires. In Germany, they created laboratories to test whether psychic power, telepathy, or ancestral memory could be weaponized. The craziest part? These weren't fringe lunatics in a basement. These were government-funded operations approved by Himmler himself. Hitler tolerated the occult obsession because it gave the SS identity and purpose. Himmler believed ancient gods would return to reward Germany, so he turned Wewelsburg Castle into a ritual fortress, complete with a Hall of the Dead, where SS officers performed ceremonies meant to awaken ancestral spirits. By 1943, as the war began collapsing, the expeditions grew more desperate. They searched for supernatural weapons, relics, artifacts, anything that could flip reality in their favor. They found nothing. The master race built its mythology on fairy tales, but millions died while fanatics searched the earth for gods who never existed. It started with panic. Rumors that the Soviets had psychic soldiers who could read secrets from across continents. The CIA freaked, because if that was even 1% true, America was blind. So instead of dismissing it, they launched Project Stargate, a decades-long experiment to create psychic spies. They recruited psychics, mediums, random civilians, even soldiers with unusual intuition. They trained them in a method called remote viewing, sitting in a silent room, sketching visions of secret bases, submarine designs, missile sites, hostage locations. Sounds ridiculous, except sometimes it worked. One viewer described a crashed Soviet plane that the CIA hadn't found yet, and they later discovered the wreck in the exact region he drew. Another identified a secret weapons factory the US didn't know existed. A third drew the interior of a kidnapped general's location. Not every session was accurate, far from it, but the hits were unsettling enough to keep the program alive for 20 years. Meanwhile, the army tested whether remote viewers could track terrorist movements, predict bombings, or detect spies. The program grew. More psychics joined. Some said they saw auras. Others claimed they sensed emotions across thousands of miles. One insisted he saw an extraterrestrial base under the Martian surface. That report is still classified. Eventually, the program died, officially, not because results were fake, but because they were unpredictable. Intelligence agencies want precision, not sometimes magic works. But here's the part they never explain. If psychic warfare was useless, why did they fund it for 2 straight decades? Why did generals sit quietly in dark rooms listening to people describe visions that shouldn't have been possible? Project Stargate didn't end because it failed. It ended because no one wanted to admit there were moments, brief, unsettling moments, when it worked. They didn't call it a lab. They called it a research station. But everyone who walked in knew exactly what it was. A slaughterhouse, built with scalpels instead of swords. Unit 731 wasn't hidden in some dark underground bunker. It sat out in the open, disguised as a water purification facility. Behind those walls, Japan ran the most brutal biological warfare program in human history, and almost nobody paid for it. It began with prisoners. Chinese civilians, soldiers, Koreans, Mongolians, even captured Americans. They were stripped of names and given numbers. You weren't a man anymore. You were a test subject. Vivisection without anesthesia was routine. They wanted to see how long organs functioned while exposed to air. They froze limbs solid, just to observe the moment skin cracked apart like glass. They infected prisoners with plague, cholera, anthrax, and then studied the progression by cutting them open while they were still breathing. Some were used as practice targets for grenades. Others were tied to stakes in open fields as Japan tested ceramic bombs packed with bacteria. This wasn't chaos. It was organized, clinical, scientific, led by doctors who went home to families at night after spending the day dissecting men alive. And the worst part? It worked. Their data was terrifyingly advanced, enough to weaponize diseases on a scale no country had ever achieved. When Japan surrendered, the world should have seen trials like Nuremberg. Instead, the US government stepped in and buried everything. Why? Because America wanted the data, wanted the breakthroughs, wanted the biological weapons advantage. The leaders of Unit 731 were granted immunity, full protection, in exchange for the research. They lived normal lives, respected careers, pensions, while their victims were dumped in mass graves, nameless and forgotten. To this day, the truth is still stitched together from survivor testimony, fragments, and whispers the world wasn't supposed to hear. Unit 731 wasn't just a war crime. It was a deal between two governments that decided human suffering was valuable, if it produced results.
The war ended, the flags changed, and the world told itself the Nazis were gone. But in truth, some of the most brilliant and most dangerous minds in Hitler's war machine didn't disappear. They switched teams. Operation Paperclip was the quiet moment when America looked at Nazi scientists and said, "We can use them." Hundreds of German engineers, doctors, chemists, physicists, some directly involved in weapons programs, forced labor, even experiments, were flown into the US under fake resumes and sanitized identities. Files were rewritten, war crimes wiped clean. Men who built V-2 rockets that leveled London suddenly became assets. Men who used prisoners as test subjects were suddenly experts. And the truth is uncomfortable. Some of America's biggest scientific leaps came from these men. NASA's Saturn V, the moon landing, guided missiles, advanced aeronautics, much of it traces back to Wernher von Braun and his team, men who designed weapons for Hitler before posing for photographs with American generals. The US justified it with one sentence: if we don't take them, the Soviets will. So morality was shelved, justice was ignored, and the Nazi scientists walked into American labs, handed security clearances, homes, paychecks, and new lives. They were no longer criminals, they were national treasures. The world remembers victory over the Nazis as clean, righteous, absolute. But Paperclip reveals a darker truth. The moment the United States decided that evil could be repurposed, rebranded, and quietly woven into the foundations of the modern American scientific empire. The price? Silence. The victims? Forgotten. And the legacy? Still orbiting above us every day. Before MKUltra became a scandal, there were two programs even darker: Bluebird and Artichoke. They were the CIA's first attempts to break the human mind, scramble identity, create obedience, erase memories, and turn people into tools. The public didn't know, even most of the government didn't know. These programs were born in locked rooms where morality didn't enter, and the only question was, can we control a person like software? They tested everything: hypnosis, forced drugging, sensory torture, sleep deprivation, electroshock, truth serums, combinations of chemicals nobody had names for, prisoners, psychiatric patients, soldiers, even foreign nationals kidnapped overseas. Anyone disposable became a test subject. They tried to see if a man could be hypnotized to kill, if they could erase a person's loyalty and rewrite it, if they could split personalities, if they could reduce someone to a blank, obedient shell. And the CIA kept terrible notes that read more like manuals for breaking a soul. They experimented with
terminal methods, meaning they knew some people wouldn't survive. They didn't care. Files describe subjects injected until they convulsed, interrogated while drugged, trapped in endless loops of fear, noise, and confusion, all to map the edges of human sanity. Bluebird asked, "How do we control someone?" Artichoke asked, "How do we destroy someone?" MKUltra wasn't the beginning of CIA mind control, it was just the moment they got caught. The real architects, the real horrors, the real breakthroughs, those lived in the shadows of Bluebird and Artichoke, where human rights weren't violated, because the CIA didn't consider their subjects human in the first place. To this day, most files remain classified or destroyed, not because they protect national security, but because they reveal exactly how far the American government was willing to go in the name of control. After hearing all of this, one thing becomes clear. The darkest chapters in history weren't accidents, they were decisions. Governments didn't just fight wars, they crossed lines, broke morality, and experimented with things the world was never supposed to know about. Mind control, psychic warfare, occult research, biological nightmares, stolen scientists, buried programs. Each project ended the same way, not with justice, but with silence. And if this is what they admitted decades later, imagine what's still locked away right now. So if you want more stories the world tried to erase, more secrets hidden behind classified files, and more history darker than fiction, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started.